Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today's episode is with a gentleman named Michael S. Sorensen. He is a best-selling author, speaker, relationship coach, and most importantly, the author of one of my absolute favorite books in the world. I've listened to it at least 5 times. I don't know exactly how many. I would guess 5 to 10 times. His book, I Hear You, The Surprisingly Simple Skill Behind Extraordinary Relationships, is something that's been a huge impact on my life. I share it with many close friends and people I work with. It's all about how to build better relationships with one simple skill, and that's validation. Being a good listener, validating people's feelings in your romantic relationships and your business relationships. It's been so impactful for me, which I even share with him in the interview that there's people now that tell me how good of a listener I am, and I've never heard that before because I love talking and sharing advice and all the things you're really not supposed to, fixing things, all the things you're not supposed to do when people are sharing with you and want to talk about important subjects to them and vent sometimes and things of that nature. So it's a really good conversation. Really smart guy, super impactful if you're hopefully looking to grow and improve all types of relationships in your life. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Like always, if you like it, share with your friends, subscribe, write a review and rate 5 stars on iTunes, and enjoy the show.
This is Openly Outspoken with Jeremy Adams, where differing opinions are not only accepted, they're encouraged.
All right, Michael, we are live. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I am really excited to have you on today. Your book, I Hear You, and I know you're involved in way more things, and we'll talk about those. But I've listened to your book more on Audible than maybe any other book. And one part of the reason, in my defense, is it's a really short book, which you did by design, right?
Yes.
So it's something, especially on 1.3, 1.4x speed, you can knock out in a long drive or in a lazy afternoon or whatever the case is. But really resonated with your book, I Hear You, and glad we're able to chat. So what is that book about? Like, what can you share what the book I Hear You is about? Because you're going to do a much better job of explaining it than I would, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So the whole premise of the book is, or the whole purpose of the book is, it teaches one key skill called validation. And it's a skill that can benefit any and all relationships in your life, right? As you know, Jeremy, but I'm kind of speaking to your listeners, right? So the skill of validation is basically helping somebody feel heard and understood. And I talk in the book about how at the end of the day, that's what all we humans crave. When we're talking with somebody and we're venting and we're complaining, we don't often want advice. What we want is to feel heard and understood, right? They want us to listen, and then they want us to respond with shared emotion, right? So if they're upset and angry, they want us to say, oh, geez, that would tick me off too, or whatever it is. But that response there that shares emotion and that connects with them, that is validation. It's basically saying to the other person, I understand how you're feeling and you're not crazy for feeling that way. And so, Jeremy, because I talk in the book, and I'm sure we can get into it later in today's interview, about how validation is not the same thing as agreeing with someone. But the core premise of this is people just want to feel heard and understood. They want to feel like they're not crazy. And I cannot tell you how valuable this is in every aspect of your life.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, I had written down to ask about the difference between agreeing and validation, because I do think there's some confusion there, myself included. What's really interesting about validation too, the political climate we're in, how much do you think both sides, right or left, are just seeking validation? And we're recording this November of 2020, by the way, so we're right after the election. So how relevant do you think validation is in our political climate right now?
Well, it's huge. And, with any emotionally charged conversation, validation should be the first tool you reach for, because it's so easy to start butting heads with people, right? It's so easy to, especially if you differ on the topic of politics, there's few conversation topics more emotionally charged than politics for many people. And so I've had to use this often. It's helped me a lot. I don't often get into political discussions, but when I do, I try to make sure the other person recognizes that I do respect them. Now, I might not agree with how they voted or who they think should be president or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, we all want to at least feel respected. And one of the mistakes I think a lot of us make when it comes to politics is we immediately assume the other person is the spawn of Satan, or at least the candidate they're endorsing. And how could any reasonable human vote for X candidate? And we got to pull that back. And validation is a great way of saying, okay, first it starts with conversations with questions, right? It's in order to validate someone, you have to understand where they're coming from. Doesn't mean you agree with it, but most people respond quite rationally given their circumstance, given their background, right? So you might start a conversation with someone and you disagree with them on a certain issue. And then you might go into that thinking you're crazy. How could you possibly endorse that person? How could you possibly believe that thing? I'm a big proponent of asking questions and you say, help me understand, where are you coming from? Like, I'm curious. Oh, okay. Almost always, if you ask enough questions, you can at least appreciate where they're coming from. Right? Because if they're missing, maybe you have more insight, maybe you have more background than they do. Well, you can't hold that against them. It's helpful to look at that and say, well, okay, I guess if you think X, Y, and Z, then makes sense why you would vote for that person, or makes sense why you would be upset about that. And I have a different perspective. Do you mind if I share that? And that's how those types of more tense conversations can go, even if emotions are running high, and even if something as sensitive as politics is on the table.
Yeah. Like, do you feel that with just kind of the climate we're in with everything, just on like a macro level, if society was just better at validating feelings, a lot of healing would be happening?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, because it's so painful. It's very vulnerable, I'll say first, to express an opinion, any opinion, especially one along politics, and especially given the climate of our country right now. It's you got to be very careful who you say what to. It doesn't matter who you voted for. We can both agree that if the other person wins the election, the world's over. That it doesn't matter who on the side you're talking to. That's generally how a lot of people feel about it, and so we have to be very careful. I think that if people were slower to jump to conclusions, I think that if they were willing to ask more questions and hold off on their opinion and hold off on their advice, we could at least be reminded that we're talking to another human. We could at least be reminded that they have feelings and hopefully use validation and just common sense and just common decency to respect them, even if we disagree with them.
For sure, and you don't have to share your viewpoint on this, by the way, but I'll share mine as an example. I do lean conservative on many things, but one thing I lean progressive on, I'm pro-choice. But I have a lot of friends that are conservative that are very pro-life, and I have a lot of friends that are pro-choice, and that's an argument that we'll probably be having till you and me are both dead, unfortunately. Like, it's just, I don't think if the country's ever going to agree on that. But my conservative friends, and I think your book has helped me with this, and I'm honestly, like, I'm not even just saying that to just be nice. Like, your book's been super helpful for me, and I would recommend it to anybody, by the way. I would say pound for pound for like a few hour audiobook, it's impactful. And it always, by the way, I feel like every few months or something, it's good to just get a little refresher, which has been good. But although I don't necessarily agree with a pro-life, I understand where they're coming from. It's just like, hey, because of my religion, because the Constitution says I value this life just like I would value our two lives. And so I'm like, okay, I put the slight, I put the women's choice for me slightly above that, but I completely understand where you're coming from, and you're making great points. And I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. And at least we can disagree on a policy, a pretty major one, but we're not like killing each other over like, you don't care about women's rights, you want babies to die. It's just like, hey, I understand where you're coming from, and that's something I've been working on myself, is when I don't agree with somebody, and I feel like politically, or where like the big disagreements are, where it's just where there's no similarities, but that's something I've been working on, and it helps in relationships tremendously. Saying, hey, we don't quite see eye to eye, but you're making amazing points, and I see where you're coming from, and like I don't disagree. Like that's the tricky thing about disagreements too, is they make, like, especially on the abortion one, which again I'm just using that as one example.
Sure.
Not saying, we don't have to talk about this too much longer. I don't know how you feel about that topic,
That's
but
fine.
we like, it's one of those topics that there is typically so much tension about, and it's just like the points that the other side are making are typically really good. Like there's like two very strong sides to the argument, and I can acknowledge the alternative strong side and say, hey, like that's okay though, and I just,
Right.
again, that validation is huge. So I think that'll be a good transition to, in your eyes, what is the biggest difference between validating and agreeing?
So I backtrack to help answer that question. To backtrack for a moment on what you were talking about, it's equally important. Meaning, knowing how to validate is important. It's also important to know when to agree to disagree, right? And it's also important to understand what your motivation is in that conversation. So if I'm talking with somebody and we disagree on a certain policy, let's say it's the abortion comment or the abortion topic, and we start talking, I need to make sure that I'm not expecting to change their mind. Now, obviously, if we're talking about it, I think debate is valuable, and I think it's important to have these conversations, because how else do people learn? How else are other points to be heard? But I think as you're talking with somebody, you say, as you're talking, you say, well, are you open to my perspective? Would you like to hear how I see it? Because some people will just say no. Most people will say yes, but they don't mean it. They're just too embarrassed. But I think there's a lot of value in at least showing that respect to say, hey, okay, it makes sense. The validation piece here, Jeremy, and what you mentioned, if you're talking with somebody and you disagree with them, you ask questions, well, help me understand. Well, why are you anti-abortion? So on and so forth. And then try to find something that you can at least understand. Again, you don't have to agree, but if they make a few points and you're like, well, okay, if that's your perspective, then it makes sense why you're voting along these lines. And you can say that, and that's validating. You're like, you know what? I think that we disagree on this policy, and yet I can appreciate where you're coming from, and that makes sense, given your beliefs. Are you open to my perspective? Or maybe you already shared your perspective, and then they shared that, and then you can just say, you know what? It's a great conversation. Obviously, I think we're going to need to agree to disagree, but I really appreciate and really respect your beliefs. You want to go grab a burger,
Yeah, and I think that type of attitude is really the only hope humanity has, right? Like we're never all going to agree on stuff, and that's okay. But what I will say though, and just from my perspective, I do feel most Americans agree on most things if you truly talk to them. Of course, there's going to be some disagreements, like one of the ones we're talking about now. But if you go line item by line item, most of them want to take care of their families. Most of them want the best for their kids. I mean, there's so many similarities, and we do spend a lot of time focusing on the differences.
Definitely.
So you're also a relationship coach, right?
Yes.
So where do you feel, and this is coming from, by the way, I'm 30 right now. I've had many small relationships or short-term relationships in my 20s. I would say like a year or less. I think one of the areas I've really struggled in, and a reason your book resonated with me, is validating their feelings and what they were saying. Where do you think like the most important ways to implement feeling validation in relationships are?
Sure. Really twofold. It's validating your partner when they're struggling with something, no matter how small you might think it is, right? That's a big point I want to underscore there. A lot of people will think, okay, I'll use validation when someone's parent dies, or when something really, that's what I can use this. But if someone comes to you and says, oh my gosh, I stubbed my toe on the way to work yesterday and it hurts so bad. Some people are like, well, come on, man, tough it up. It's a toe. But validation's valuable even there. Just saying, oh, that sucks, especially because you kind of need your toes to walk, and they're like, yeah, thank you, and then you can go on with your conversation. And so relationships in general, I mean, we have really two types of relationships, right? You have your transactional, you're very platonic, these might be your coworkers or your boss or people that you just talk to day to day. You can get through life with those types of relationships without much emotional connection. It's nice to add emotion in there because then you connect deeper, but you don't need it. When we're talking about romantic or intimate or, those types of relationships, you need to have vulnerability, meaning open communication, willingness to share your emotions. And then that vulnerability needs to be met with acceptance, validation, and appreciation. And so if you're missing either vulnerability or validation and appreciation in a relationship, it's probably not going to last very long. And I say that from personal experience because one of my, Jeremy, from the book, I talk relatively early on about how I was dating a woman at the time who was very good at listening, but didn't validate at all. And I didn't know it by name at the time, right? But I shared that experience where I was out on a date with her and I was sharing this exciting thing that happened at work, and this happened and that happened, and I'm all animated as I'm explaining it to her. And I finish and she says, cool. And that was it. Right? And I remember looking at her like, that's all you're going to say? I mean, and I couldn't figure out in the moment what I was missing, but I was very let down. In hindsight, I realized I was missing validation. I wanted her to respond with shared interest and appreciation and say, well, that's awesome. What then did you do? Or that must feel so amazing because of all the work you put in. Anything like that would have been very validating, and it would have helped me feel more connected to her emotionally.
Absolutely. And I can relate too, because before I heard the term validation, and I like to talk, that's why I started this show, you deep down want it because you're sharing something exciting or something that you discovered or something you learned, and it feels great to have somebody give a shit about what you're
right.
You're talking about. So let's look at from the woman's perspective there. Are you guys dating still, by the way?
No, we're not.
Okay.
Nope. Married to a different woman. Life's great.
Okay.
Respect and appreciate that woman, but no, not me.
Your current wife validates your feelings, I'm just
She does, yes.
That's awesome. Yes. So what, from that woman's perspective, and maybe for people listening that want to start validating others more effectively, do you have some recommendations that people can implement in their lives for that?
Absolutely. So, Jeremy, in my book, I mentioned the 4-step validation method. It's something I basically reverse engineered from thousands of successful validation experiences and tried to put together a kind of a loose framework for people to follow if they're struggling with implementing it. A lot of us do elements of validation naturally, and a decent number of us don't. And that's fine. That's neither here nor there. That's why I wrote the book and why we're talking, right? Is trying to kind of teach people this skill. But those 4 steps are, first, to listen empathically, meaning listen for the emotion that they're sharing rather than just the words. Second is to validate. And again, we've talked about what validation looks like, but it's basically identifying an emotion and then offering some kind of justification for that emotion. So saying, that's awesome, especially because all that work you did, or gee, that really sucks, and especially given how much time you put into it, right? So that's step 2, is to validate. Then step 3 is when you give advice or assurance, and we can talk more about that later. And 4th is to validate again. So the reason I have those 4 steps is the order is important. If somebody's concerned, they're worried about something and you don't feel like they should be worried about it, you might be tempted to just tell them not to worry about it. Oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, don't worry about it. But if you put yourself in that person's shoes for a moment, how does that feel? Right? If you're worried and you're coming to someone and you're saying, oh, I'm so scared, and they say, well, don't be. You're like, oh, well, thanks, yeah, but I am. We can't just turn the fear switch off when somebody tells us to. So first step is to listen, then validate. I tell people the biggest shortcut to this is to just hold off on your advice. If someone's complaining to you, you're about to jump in for advice, just stop and just give it another minute, or ask a few more questions at least. That alone can make a huge difference in the connection you feel with people, not just your romantic relationships. Again, I'm talking coworkers, I'm talking children, I'm talking parents. Ease up on the advice a little bit. Validate first, and it will change your connection.
Yeah, and I can tell you again, I still have a long way to go, but I definitely have noticed some improvements in my life. I've had people tell me that I'm a great listener, which I've always been kind of insecure about that. I ask myself, am I a good listener? I feel like maybe I'm not the best listener, but I've had people actually tell me that I've been a good listener in the last year or two, which has been validating for me, ironically.
Yeah.
So where do you feel like one issue I have with people's shares, and something this may be the thing I've had to work on the most, is the advice / fixing side of things. Like, how can we get out of the habit of, well, I guess we should distinguish the difference between validating and listening, and trying to offer advice and fix too, which is so many of our, myself included, natural response when people are sharing challenges, right?
Yep.
How do we get out of that habit?
It's a hard one to break. I stand before you here today. I don't know how long it's been, 4 years after I published the book. And just a month ago, my wife was complaining to me about something. And guess what I did? I said, oh, you should just do this, or did you do that? And I tried to give her advice. She actually stopped me and she's like, for the guy that wrote the book on validation, you really suck at it right now. I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I just jumped right into trying to fix the problem. And so we kind of laughed at it, and I apologized, and I said, you're right. I apologize for jumping in like that. So it's not something that I think any of us can just immediately stop doing forever. But I think it starts with this kind of conversation. I think it starts with listening to this interview, reading the book, and just paying attention to it. And I found that when people start to have experiences where it makes a big difference, that really helps drive it home. The first time someone's talking to you and you're about to give them advice and you instead just listen and validate, you're going to see how well that plays out. And most people write in, they're like, I had no idea. Like, I had no idea how much better my conversations go when I just hold my advice back. I'll share a brief story, Jeremy, where I was talking to my brother a number of years ago. Actually, it was back when I was still writing the book. And he called me up, and he was dealing with a difficult breakup. And we were talking, and he did ask for my advice early on. So I started thinking, okay, well, what advice would I give him? And I could relate to him because I had been in a similar situation earlier. But as we talked, I thought, I'm just going to validate him first and see where this goes. And so we talked, and I said, man, that really sucks. Like, it's especially hard because you're still going to bump into her at these social gatherings. You're still going to see her on Instagram, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yeah, seriously, like, that's it, And that to me was the sign that I was validating well, that he was like, yes, you get it. You understand. That's the reaction that we look for when we're trying to connect with someone. And so at the end, I was about to give him my advice, but I instead decided to ask him a question. And I said, well, so what are you going to do about it? And he paused for a second, and he said, well, I think I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And it was the exact advice I was about to give him. He already knew how to manage his situation. He just needed somebody to hear and appreciate how difficult it was, and he was able to sail on forward without me saying another word. So it's really powerful to just recognize, hold off on the advice, ask more questions if you're having a hard time understanding, right? If you can't find an emotion or a reason to validate, ask another question. Just say, well, then what happened? Or, sheesh, how did that make you feel? Or, okay, so why did you go this direction instead of that? Whatever it is, you ask enough questions and you care about the person enough, you're going to understand how they're feeling and at least appreciate where they're coming from. And that alone is a huge gift. Very few people offer that. And you will see in the other person's response just how much they appreciate it.
That's a great share. And you talk about that quite a bit in the book, I believe. And that's, again, just something I have to get better at. Most people know the solutions you talk about, right? They're just looking to share. Do you have any idea psychologically, like because I feel would maybe help me understand, like, why, if we already know the solutions, why does it make us feel better to share?
So emotions are unruly creatures. right? Especially the difficult ones or the quote unquote bad emotions. To talk about that briefly, I think that's one of the biggest issues with our society today is that we judge emotions or we bucket emotions. Certain emotions are good and certain emotions are bad, right? And we look at anger and embarrassment or resentment. Okay, resentment's not great, but all these things, we label them as bad and we say you shouldn't feel them. And then on the flip side, we say, well, you should be happy. You should be chipper. You should be calm. And the problem with that is that, first off, emotions are neither good nor bad. They just are. Okay, they're these feelings, they come up, and oftentimes we can't control them. They well up inside of us, and they're tough to manage. The problem is that if we've now labeled anger as bad, so I'm all upset and I want to go talk to somebody about it, and they say, don't be angry. Well, then it's like, well, shoot, well, then what's wrong with me? Like, he doesn't think I should be angry, but I am angry. So am I just a bad person? Like, if I'm embarrassed or I'm scared and someone says, don't be scared, well, that's quite shaming. It's like, well, okay, well, maybe I'm just weak, maybe I'm just whatever. And what we end up doing is we repress those emotions and we push them down because everybody we talk to is saying, don't feel those. So we say, okay, I won't. But they don't go away. They still control us, as is evidenced by addictions or at least addictive behavior. You just suddenly snap at somebody who's been weighing on you for 6 months. It never ends well when we repress our emotions. So the reason validation works so well, and the reason I think we share with other people, is that we often need some outside help to process those. Emotions, they kind of disappear once you bring them out into the open. It's kind of like an infected wound, or if you keep stitching it up, it's going to keep building. It's going to keep oozing, right? It just gets nasty. What you have to do in most instances is open it up, clean it out, and air it out, right? Let it heal out in the open. And that's how our emotions work, at least the difficult ones. That if you think about a little child, when they're just learning how to manage their emotions, it's scary to them. And they wear their heart on their sleeve. You can see exactly what they're feeling most of the time. And it's important to let them know, okay, that's okay. Yeah, that is scary. And when you say that is scary, that gives them permission. They don't feel like they're crazy or stupid. And then they just process it. It's amazing how it just kind of heals itself 9 times out of 10 when we feel like there's room and space to feel whatever we're feeling. And so to answer your question directly, I think that's why we share with people so often, is we're looking for that assurance that we're not crazy. We're looking for appreciation in our struggle.
Yeah, that struggle. And so, if you see me looking down, I'm just like writing notes down, or if I have a question to ask you so I don't forget, just so I'm not like gaming or anything over here or texting.
Texting your girlfriend.
Yeah.
You want for lunch?
Yeah. Let me see here. No, I agree with that completely, and it's taken me years to learn this. As society, so we're told we shouldn't feel a certain way, and that we shouldn't think a certain way, which is not good at all, right? Like, and fortunately, that's why therapy, even if you don't have an expert level therapist, if you have somebody that just sits there and listens to you, it's so powerful, and that's why I wish therapy didn't have such a negative connotation, because even at the most basic level, entry level therapists, like in school, it's still somebody to listen to you and just not judge and shake their head. But like even thoughts too, like we have these, like, and again, I like talking about all sorts of subjects, and I think this is relevant, and you don't necessarily have to share your opinion on this if you want, but like racism is really prevalent. The conversation of racism is really prevalent in 2020. Mm-hmm. And if people are having racist thoughts, we shouldn't be telling them they shouldn't have, like if thoughts are coming up and feelings are coming up, oftentimes they can't control those thoughts or feelings. So the solution is actually having those thoughts, saying, hey, I'm like, not that I have like a whole bunch of racist thoughts coming up with my therapist, but I have some thoughts that I'm not really proud to share and admit, right? The solution isn't saying, hey, you shouldn't be feeling that way, you shouldn't be thinking that way. Like, let's talk about these things, and then next time they come up, you can be like, okay, I'm thinking this way because of this pattern or whatever it is. I know this isn't who I want to be, and you can kind of self-correct, but it's not telling yourself or telling people they shouldn't think or feel a certain way, it's like, hey, I'm acknowledging that I'm thinking and feeling this way. I no longer want to think and feel this way. Here's some ways to possibly improve on that, right? And again, this is my self-talk that I've been trying to improve in areas of my life. What are your thoughts on that overall?
I couldn't agree more. And I think it goes back to that same principle of emotion, where if we have thoughts that keep popping up and we keep repressing them, they also rarely go away, right? Usually, it actually gives them more power. There's kind of that mentality of what you focus on grows that would apply here, right? It's so overused, but I can't think of a better example. When you say to someone, "Don't think of a pink elephant," like immediately you think of a pink elephant, you know. And so if you say, "Well, don't think this thought, don't think this thought," well, you keep giving that thought power, and you do yourself a disservice by not exploring it.
Yeah.
Because again, most of us are quite rational people. It doesn't always look like it, especially to others and sometimes to ourselves, but that's because we're refusing to, or we just don't see the bigger picture. So, I do this often when I look at people that I initially really don't like. You know, I whether it's a coworker or just a stranger, or whether it's a world leader even, you know, it's easy to look at somebody from afar and say, well, they're an idiot. That's stupid. Like, how could they do that? They're horrible, right? And sometimes we do that to ourselves. How could I have this thought? How on earth could I act this way? Why did I do that? And if we just stop there, that's very judgmental and does no one any good. But if you instead get curious about it and you say, well, that's an interesting thought. I'm uncomfortable about that. Wonder where that's coming from. You know, that can be very instructive because it's a sign. I believe our emotions and even our thoughts are gifts to us, and they're signs, they're invitations to look deeper. And so that's why, to your point, Jeremy, I'm with you. Therapy is immensely valuable. Take it from a guy who did 4 years of it. You know, like, it transformed my life. And in large part, it is because it's that safe space to explore things and to get at the underlying reasons behind it. And so, you know, I was talking with a client the other day who was saying, well, how do I manage this conversation with somebody in my family who's very racist? Like very, very aggressive racist. And of course, I don't agree with that. And I'm trying to get them to stop. What do I do? Like, how on earth would I validate them? And of course, out the gates, you're like, well, of course you don't want to validate that. That's wrong. But I'll challenge you on that, because if you want that other person to even have a prayer at seeing a different perspective, they need to at least feel respected. And so my advice to this person was, get curious. Like, ask them, like, why? I'm curious. Why do you feel that way? You know, was there something that happened? I mean, and let's just say for a moment that particular person witnessed a horrific crime by somebody of that particular race. Well, suddenly that gives you at least a little more understanding behind why they're acting the way they are, right? Doesn't excuse it. It doesn't mean that now they get to be racist, but it at least gives you a little more insight. And so that's why I'm such a big proponent of curiosity and of at least digging a little deeper, because then in that person's instance, that person's situation, it at least gives them a chance to discuss it. And who knows, they may even be able to help that person recognize, oh, well, that is why I'm feeling this way. And yeah, you're right, that was an isolated instance. And okay, I guess I can appreciate how maybe I've got some work to do there. Whereas you would never have gotten there if you just kept saying, don't be racist, don't be racist, don't be racist. That doesn't help. So I'm getting a little long-winded here, but all of that to say, I agree that we need to dig deeper into our thoughts and our emotions and not be so quick to judge.
I couldn't agree more with that, and I'll give you a similar example with, and I won't say who, but it's an older person that's someone in my life, and they said some racist comments, and I recently did get a little curious, rather than just being like, why the F would you say that? Like, blah, blah, blah. Like, hey, like, I don't necessarily agree. Like, where does that come from? And it ended, after going through the conversation, it ended up coming out like, hey, when my kids were little, it was when they were starting to integrate schools. And my daughters got put at a school that was majority black. And I'm sure if it was majority white or majority black, it wasn't obviously going to be equal everywhere. That, when you just overnight integrate a bunch of schools, my kids were picked on, and, So it's just like, okay, obviously I don't agree with what you're saying and I don't support the comments you're saying, but I kind of understand your feeling because it's a little personal to you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like, hey, like, wouldn't it have been great to sit down with the parents of those kids and sit, I'm sure their parents, if they would have known, would have been like disgusted. Don't treat people like that, right? Like, especially during that time. So again, it doesn't mean I agree with the comments, but it's okay. I can kind of understand where those thoughts are coming from, and if this person's never had therapy or talked through it or analyzed these feelings and just been bottling it in for decades potentially, you can understand why there could be some anger with those.
Totally. Totally. Well, and that's then what you just said, Jeremy, is validating. To say, well, as they're sharing the experience, sometimes you don't even have to say words to validate. So if you were sharing that to me, Jeremy, and saying, well, this is what happened with my kids as I was growing up, I'd be going, geez, are you kidding me? Like shaking my head, like, that's painful. Of course. And that's validating. And then to say, okay, well, given what you went through, I can at least appreciate where you're coming from. I can at least see where those thoughts are coming from. And of course, as you know, I still think that your comments are hurtful. Are you open to a different perspective, Or maybe you say, can you at least appreciate that that was an isolated instance and not everybody acts like that? There are options now. You have multiple jumping off points in that conversation. And hopefully that person's open to more of a dialogue, and they're going to be more willing to listen to you, most likely, once you first listened to them and once you first validated them and they feel like, all right, well, Jeremy gets me at least. Like I've shared that. I don't share that with most people, but I can tell that he's being respectful here. Let's talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe most prejudice in general, racism is a form of prejudice. I don't think it's as much hate and fear as it's much just maybe slightly fear, but not as much hate, just unknown and ignorance and just like, and I think that just having the type of conversations that we're having, whether it's racism or any other big topic, it's just so powerful. Like this is how we're going to make headway. And I don't know if I want to get in politics. I've thought about maybe at some point when I'm a bit older, but because of like these steps I'm taking in my own life, I feel I would be really, really productive and just having conversations with both sides and saying, hey, like, you're making good points. I know you want to earn more wages, or I know you feel you're treated unfair. I know, business owner, you're making good points. Hey, you can only afford to pay a certain high of wages, and you're hiring based off of who you think is the best fit. Like, and just kind of just acknowledge that both people maybe feel that they're 100% right. Like both people can in their mind be 100% right. Some things aren't like binary where there's a facts or like they both could be right in their eyes.
Exactly. Well, I use the analogy of describing an elephant. I was talking with a client a couple of months ago. I was actually talking with both husband and wife independently on different coaching calls. And they were both explaining what they felt the problem was in their relationship. And I agreed with both of them. And I think that if they were both in the same room hearing me agree with both of them, they probably would think that I'm being double-faced. Like, well, you just agree with me. Well, yeah, I did. And the other guy would say, well, you just agree with me. Well, yeah, I did. Well, how, and that's because they thought that it was one or the other, all or nothing. And as I was listening, I just recognized them describing an elephant. The husband was just describing the back half of the elephant, and the wife was just describing the first half of the elephant. Like, you put both together, that's your problem. Right? You guys have mismatched expectations and so on and so forth. But you're spot on that it's most of the time they mean well. Most of the time they're acting quite rationally, all things considered. And if you just show them that you hear them, then they're willing to back off a little bit. So yeah, if you're trying to mediate between two parties and you hear both sides and you validate them and you say, there's a lot of great stuff to think about, let's reconvene in a week. Well, now they're like, okay, well, he heard me. Like, I don't know what the decision's going to be, but he at least heard me. And both parties are going to say that same thing. So you're spot on, man, that it's like, I'm consistently amazed at how valuable the skill of validation paired with just curiosity and open-mindedness is like a superpower. I mean, like I've had some very emotionally charged conversations with people, not just politics, right? But people accusing me of some pretty bad things, and people saying, well, you did this and I hate you that and can't believe you did that and X, Y, and Z, you name it. All of them, none of them have been fun, but all of them have ended relatively positively. And whether if the emotion started really high, it always ends much calmer. And people are taking deeper breaths, myself included. And so it's really worth the time to really invest in developing the skill, because it will carry it with you your entire life, whether you do go into politics or anywhere. It's seriously a superpower.
And as you're talking about mediation, I was just picturing the opening scene from Wedding Crashers. You know what I'm talking about? Where it was like the husband and wife, they're getting a divorce, and they're the two main guys, Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson, are like mediation attorneys, and they're like, have you seen that movie, Wedding Crashers?
I haven't, no.
Oh, you haven't seen Wedding Crashers? No. It's hilarious, and they're just like fighting, but ultimately it kind of ends the scene because they both are validating, and then they end up trying to be super generous to the other person in the divorce mediation. They're just like, you can have the points because they were just like listening, and I don't know. It ended up where they went from not wanting either person to have anything to like they were giving each other extra stuff, and it was really funny because it's a vulgar comedy. But we talked about children for a second there. One thing, maybe the thing that stuck out to me most in your book, was the story where you were saying I think there was a kid drawing something at a restaurant, and he was just trying to show his dad what he drew, and the dad was just looking at his phone and was like, hey, that's great, son. And that hit me so much because I felt that was what my childhood lacked, was that validation. I felt, looking back, I was a smart kid, I was doing really cool things, and I just lacked that validation. Like, can we talk about the importance of validation? And maybe you can elaborate on that example as well and explain it a little bit better than I just did. But the importance of validation with your kids.
Yeah. Well, my heart aches for you to hear that. And because I've seen so many people, kids and adults who were obviously once kids, in similar situations. And so, yeah, that example sticks with me still to this day, Jeremy. And for those who haven't read the book, what happened was, back when I was writing my book, I went to the local Wendy's after work and just, ordered my dinner. And I sat down and I pulled out my phone. And then I thought, well, Michael, put it away. Let's practice being present here for a little bit. And so I sat down and I looked across the table, and I saw a young boy who was probably 7 or 8 years old, and his father. And the little boy was playing with this little 3D puzzle, is what it was. And he was trying to kind of figure out how to make the pieces fit. And the dad was just scrolling on his smartphone. And so I sat there as I waited and I watched. And I was, it was kind of sad to me to see them not interacting with each other. But I tried to hold off on judgment because you never know, right? But as I sat there, I watched as the little kid finally clicked the last piece into place of his puzzle. And his eyes just lit up. I mean, he was stoked. So proud. And he holds it up in front of his dad and he says, Dad, look. And his dad looked up from his phone and said, cool. And then looked right back down and kept scrolling. And in that moment, my eyes were fixated on the little boy because he was still holding the puzzle up there and his dad was no longer looking at him. And after a few seconds, he put it back down in his lap and kept playing. And that hurt me. Because as I looked at that, I thought, what was that little boy wanting? He was wanting that validation. He was wanting his dad to say, wow, nice work. Those puzzles are hard. And that would have taken, 3 extra seconds for him to say? But in that moment, that father missed an opportunity to connect and buoy up and support his son. And so, like I said, I'm careful to not judge because who knows what was going on in that man's life. Nevertheless, the point still holds that we have opportunities all around us to validate and to validate the positive. And so whether it is our coworkers and whether it's our spouse, our friends, or our family, or whether it's our young children, there's such a gift there in taking a moment to recognize someone's achievement and or to recognize their struggle and show them that we appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean it completely makes sense. And as a child, I feel like, and again, I think my parents sometimes listen to this show, so this isn't any type of attack. I think like no one's perfect, right? So this is an area I've struggled in my relationships. Like that's why I don't think I've had a major reason why I haven't had a super successful relationship over the years. But just looking back, it made a lot of sense because I felt I worked really hard in school. By the time I got to high school, I started slacking off, but I always worked really hard in school. Like I was doing magic tricks. I was a magician. I like gamed a lot. I like built computers. I just felt like I did a lot of cool stuff and stuff I worked really hard on and trying to be like do things great. And I also didn't grow up with my dad too, so he wasn't around that much, and I think that was lacking too. It's just like maybe like male validation or something from my father. But yeah, it just looking back at it. So do you feel if kids don't have validation a lot growing up, because my little brother, I feel is similar to me in this way. Does that affect them in their adult lives, where maybe it makes their love language words of affirmation at like an extreme level, or how does that affect kids in their adult lives from your experience that don't have validation growing up?
Yeah, it seems to go one of two ways. You either grow up just clawing for it from any source you can get it because you've never had it and it will probably never be enough, or you emulate what your parents did and you don't offer it to other people. And again, I deal with both in the clients that I work with, where I see some people that are just they're like, no, I don't understand why I need to make somebody feel better. I don't understand why I need to listen to their problems. And they wear it like a badge of pride. But if you really dig deep and if they're really humble and willing to look at it, they'll admit, well, it's because I didn't have it, or I don't feel like my needs are worth it, or I don't, it comes across as very look at me high and mighty, but really it's very self-protecting. They've got walls up. And so, yes, I mean, I will share from my childhood. Similarly, my parents loved me. I know they still love me. They were fantastic parents, and they weren't perfect because no one's perfect. And so as I started learning about validation, I looked back and I thought, interesting. I noticed that growing up, I always confided in my mom, and I didn't go to my dad very often.
Yeah.
And I couldn't quite understand why. I mean, I still love my dad and we had a great relationship, and it wasn't quite the same as with my mom. And what I found out in hindsight, as I looked back retrospectively, it's because my mom was quick to validate and then she would give advice later. My dad was quick to give advice and might not ever validate later. And that was a big eye opener to me. And I talked with my dad about it, and he's been working on it. And I'll tell you now, when I'm talking with him, I've had numerous instances now, just in the past few months, where he has been immensely validating because I know he's working on it. And so he'll just say to me, by the way, I see how much work you're doing. I recognize the late nights you're putting in, whatever it is. And he'll go off and he'll validate me for 10 seconds. And I'm like brought to tears almost because I was so, like, I wanted that so much from my father, like you said. And so for any parents listening, if you feel like you were doing a service to your child by telling them to not cry, telling them to shut up, hopefully you don't feel like telling them to shut up as a service, right? But if you feel like your stoicism is respectful and it's helping them, it's not. And I encourage you to try validating the next time they're talking and see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of some examples real quick, and I'm curious to your thoughts. Like my little brother, so we're business partners as well, and I actually brought this up to him recently. I could have maybe worded it more effectively, but he got kind of defensive, which I expect most people would. He'll make little sarcastic comments very, very regularly, like me and him just went to the World Series, right? That's why we had to reschedule, if you recall.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
He got my dad a program. He brought back a program, and he was like, Dad, I waited in line a long time and like brought this back and kept it in good shape, and like I did this just for you. Like, and I don't even know if he like realizes he's saying stuff like that, but like to me, and again, this is just because I've been doing this type of work, it's a cry for love for my dad to be like, wow, you did all that just for me.
Right.
Right. And he'll do that regularly with like business, like, hey, like I did this, I got this, and like he's just like, like an extreme level, like not that it's like hurting him from being successful, but I'm starting to pick up on it more and more, where it's just like an extreme need for validation because, I don't think he really got it growing up. And it comes up like, and sometimes it'll be like in like a sarcastic way too. Like, hey, like I'll share an idea. He'll be like, well, I said that idea like 3 months ago, but no worries, don't worry about it. And it's like, it's
passive aggressive.
Yeah, it's deep down and be like, oh yeah, you did. That was a great idea. Like, it's just like the credit and like stuff comes up. And I have to imagine a lot of that is from just lacking validation throughout his life.
Yeah. And I sympathize with him, and I know you mean no disrespect to him. I think it's a great example because I think we all know people like that. I certainly had friends growing up that were just craved validation, and it made me not want to validate them at all. Because I'm like, I don't want to fuel this. And we could talk a little more later if you want about how to deal with people like that. But in your brother's situation, and really anybody who resonates with that, there is a fine line, because I am a big proponent of asserting ourselves and of sharing when we're proud, and even asking for credit when we feel it's deserved. It's such a fine line, though, that from being assertive onto being needy, right? And I think a lot of that comes down to we have to work on ourselves to make sure we walk that line well, to where your brother or anybody, myself included, needs to find ways to validate ourselves, to feel like we are worthwhile in and of ourselves. Because if we're looking to others to tell us that we matter, right, that our core worth matters, they can't give that to us.
Yeah.
So I do want to draw that distinction here that, some therapists that you'll talk to, they'll say you shouldn't seek validation from people. You don't need it. And that's true when they're talking about validating your worth.
Yeah.
You can't get that from anyone. However, we do need validation of our emotions and our feelings and our actions from other people. But at our core, if we are always looking to others to tell us that we're good enough, and until they do, we resent them or we feel bad about ourselves, well, that's a sign that we have some work to do. And again, there's that plug for therapy.
No, for sure. And to be clear, like, I feel I can recognize it so much in my brother because it's stuff I still do. I think I've improved a lot, so I don't think it's quite as bad as I used to be. But yeah, I shared that with him because I was like, hey, like, I have similar patterns because we grew up similarly, right? And
right.
He's about 5 years younger than me, so he's not exactly on the path of like the self-work and stuff that I've been on, which maybe he will at some point, maybe he won't, I don't know. But this is what's crazy too about relationships. So maybe I agree, you only can like love yourself. You only can validate yourself on a worthiness level. No external validation is going to help. But I also agree, sometimes it feels, with that being said, you can still love yourself and still appreciate compliments and nice things as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I feel like I love myself, but if someone that I care about says, hey, you did a great job on that still feels good too, right?
Right.
And so many of us, and this is, again, I'll see my little brother do it. I know I do it. Rather than just telling my dad or telling somebody in my life, hey, you know what? When you say nice things and you congratulate me and thanks me, it makes me feel really good. Like, just sharing, say, hey, when you reach out to me, when you text me first, when you tell me good night, I love you, it makes me really happy. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the actual solution, just sharing that feeling, which I'm trying to get better at. But so many of us don't even do that, and we just expect the other person to know what makes us feel good.
Right.
And that's like, there's a female friend of mine was having an issue. She's like, I like when the guy that I'm talking to tells me good morning and that to have a great day, and it just makes me feel good. And I may have brought this up on a previous episode, but and then he just stopped doing it the last few days. I was like, well, have you ever told him that you really like it? She's like, no. I'm like, but why? I don't want to be weird and tell him that. I'm like, that's not being weird. It would make him feel like he's not being weird because he's probably thinking he's bugging the shit out of you. So
exactly.
Does what I'm saying make sense? Like, do you resonate with that?
For sure. I mean, I can't remember if I told you, but I just recently launched an online course called the Extraordinary Relationships Master Course, where I talk about validation, but also boundaries and a whole slew of other things. One of the biggest ones is expectations, that I've done a number of videos on for that exact reason, because that's where that assertiveness comes into play. That we talk so much about validation and how we need to offer it and how great it feels to receive it. And yet people can't read our minds, So I love your example of that woman who's saying, well, he just stopped. And what's up? Well, you're probably spot on. The guy was probably like, well, gee, I'm probably bugging her, so I'm going to stop. It's a simple misunderstanding there. And a lot of people will say, well, doesn't that take the romance out of it if I have to tell my partner what I like and I don't like? And to that, I just give them a few examples. I'm like, what's more romantic? Like trying to manipulate and control your partner and then being passive aggressive when they don't show up the way you want? Or saying, hey, I love you and this matters a lot to me. Would you be willing to do this? At least to me, I think the latter is more romantic. I was talking to a friend of mine a while back. We were coming up on Valentine's Day. Well, it was Valentine's Day. And we were chatting at work. And I said, hey, like any fun plans tonight with your girlfriend? And he just lit up. And he said, yeah, I got her this big bouquet of flowers. Well, actually, what he said before was, he said, yeah, last week, my girlfriend said to me, hey, Valentine's Day is coming up, and I don't know what you have planned, but I just want to let you know it would really mean a lot to me if you got me some flowers and if we ate out at this restaurant that evening. And my friend turned to me and he kind of laughed and he said, and I was so glad she said that because I wasn't planning any of that. Like, I suck at special occasions and I just don't even know what to do. So the fact that she laid out what she wanted, and she did it, I will say, in a very kind, respectful way, not in a demanding, entitled way. She didn't say, I want this and I need this and that, and it was going to cost him $2,000. But she said, this is what would matter to me.
Yeah.
And are you open to it? And he was like, yeah, like, thanks for letting me know. So those expectations are big, and we have to communicate them to people if we are going to hold them accountable for it. We don't get to resent people later if they didn't read our minds.
100%. And I'm a big core values guy, and my number one core value for many, many years has been freedom. But what freedom is now my number two, because I made my number one as of today, November of 2020, is authentic love, connection, and communication.
I like that.
That's just so important in all areas of our lives. Co-workers, family, romantic, obviously the more important with the people you spend most time with, but I've just started to realize like how like crucial that is. And I can't be around anybody that doesn't align with me there. I've realized, like, cause I'm not, I've had so many people over the years be like, oh, you're just too much. And that was really hard for me to hear because, like, am I an over communicator? I started doubting myself. And then I realized not until recently, maybe the last couple years, like, the right people for me are going to love that level of communication. And it's most likely that these people are saying I'm too much because they're not comfortable sharing their feelings. They're not. So to them, I am too much, which, again, the old me maybe would have tried to fix them and try to change them. But now I'm just going to connect or hang out with people that I align with and that can share things and can be open and honest. And it's just made me so much happier, and I have such better relationships because of it.
I love that. I preach all the time, everywhere, that we have to take responsibility for our own happiness. And I know it probably sounds cliche, but especially in a relationship, it makes all the difference in the world. Because like you're saying, we can go through life trying to make other people like us, or trying to make other people do certain things or whatever, or we can just figure out what matters to us, what we will and won't put up with, communicate to people, set boundaries, and then associate with the people that we want to associate with. And the latter is a much freer, right? So it ties into freedom right there too, way to live life. Because you just realize you are an agent. You have your own choice. You're not a victim to anyone. I've talked to some people who sometimes will push back on what I'm teaching, and they say, well, you don't understand because people have really serious trauma, really bad things that happen. Like, we can't just turn it around, like you don't realize how my mom abused me or how this happened. And to all of that, I'm like, hey, I'm not questioning any of that, and I'm not downplaying any of that. Yeah, that's a brutal childhood. And what are you going to do about it? Not to sound harsh, but at the end of the day, we're adults, and we need to make decisions whether or not we're going to sit and continue to stew and let former abusers or parents or whatever continue to hurt us now, or if we're going to seek help, if we're going to find a therapist, if we're going to connect with people who are actually going to help us rather than continue to go back to the people who will harm us. So I really like that focus on connection and authenticity. And I think paired with that personal responsibility is huge.
For sure. Thank you. What have there been any crazy life-changing stories or anything you've heard since you've released the book where people have reached out to you? Like anything come to mind where it was just like, I read your book and this crazy thing happened to me and like, thank you, it changed my life. Like any crazy story come to mind?
So I've had several. Really, every story is crazy to me because, as you know from reading the book, I never aspired to be an author. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a researcher, right? All this kind of stuff. So every reader email is amazing to me.
By the way, I want to interrupt you real quick on that. I respect that, and that was what resonated with me. Like I think you shared that to start the book because I didn't finish college. You know, I've started multiple businesses. Most people around me are more formally educated than me, and so again, early in my career, I felt a little bit of a lack of confidence or a major lack of confidence because it's like, am I smart enough? Am I capable enough? And I think a lot of times people just use that as excuses why they're not doing something.
Yeah,
So,
well, I agree.
But anyway, sorry to interrupt, but
No,
please,
you're fine. Thank
please
you.
share.
Yeah, so one of the most impactful emails that I've received, well, twofold. One was a man in the military. He grew up his whole life active military, and it's actually the #1 most helpful review on Amazon right now because he basically says, I struggle my whole life dealing with this. I've learned to turn my emotions on and off like a light switch thanks to the military, and I've never had a great relationship. And basically he said, I started trying validation only halfway through the book, and already my partner, whoever it was, he didn't say, said, I can tell that you're working on this, thank you. You know, and he ended it by saying, try it because it works for me, and I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, I think is what he said. And he said, and this might help, this simple thing, may have saved me from being an old grumpy man years down the line. And that was really powerful to me. And then shortly thereafter, I received an email from a woman who said that her mother was recently diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, I'll pause here for a second and say one of the questions people ask me quite often is, well, are there times when you shouldn't validate? And, you know, often people think, well, probably with certain mental illnesses, you wouldn't want to. And I would have thought maybe schizophrenia might be one of those, depending on what they're sharing with you, right? Well, this woman said that she had a great relationship with her mother, and they used to talk for hours on end. I think every week they would call each other, and her mom would always ask how her life was, and they would chit-chat, go back and forth. Well, fast forward to post-diagnosis of schizophrenia, this woman was saying, my relationship with my mom has deteriorated. Like, now the phone calls are just all taken up by conspiracy theories or different delusions or things that she's dealing with. And I didn't want to validate, I didn't want to say and encourage that, so I just didn't know how to talk to her. And she said, she hasn't asked me about my life in a year. And she said, I grabbed your book and I started reading it, and I decided to try validating my mom the next phone call. And she said that she did that. She said, basically, oh, Mom, like I can't even imagine, you know, if that's what you think is happening, or this is happening, I can't even imagine that. And she said the relief was audible in her mom's voice. And then for the first time in a year, her mom asked her how her day was. And she said that since then, they've rebuilt a fantastic relationship. And it all points back to this core principle of validation and how simple it is, but how powerful it can be.
Wow, man, that's a great story.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many positive examples. I feel like my business relationships are better. My romantic relationships have been better. Still not perfect. I still got a lot of challenges, but the validation thing, I can agree has been huge. Surprising, there's not too many more books about this topic, right? Like that.
Yeah.
You're onto something, you know.
Yeah. It's been very exciting and very humbling for me, you know, and that's why I appreciate opportunities like this, because my aim still is sincerely to just get it out there. You know, it sounds so cheesy, it sounds so cliche, but I really did write the book, and I continue to create this course that I mentioned, all kinds of other things, because I feel this almost like divine push to just keep sharing it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, can we talk about what you're up to with the the course. Can you share?
Yeah. So the book, we've talked a lot about validation, but I mentioned that that was just one principle and skill that I learned from 4 years of therapy. And what I found is I tried to work in a lot of the other principles into the book, but I kept the focus on validation. But like we've already been talking about on this call, there are a lot of additional principles and skills that we need to understand to really thrive in life. And those are principles of personal responsibility, the idea of boundaries, is something I spend a lot of time on in this course because that's what I work with my clients most often on is, yeah, okay, now that you know how to validate, how do you still stick up for yourself? How do you hold other people accountable? How do you live life proactively rather than just feeling like, oh, so-and-so is going to take advantage of me? So I talk in the course about boundaries. I talk about expectations, including how to recognize expectations, how to address them with people. I talk about, I don't want to get long-winded here, but principles of codependency, different language tweaks we can make. I talk in the book about the difference between using and but in a conversation, right? And that's a really powerful one.
I've implemented that in my life, by the way, the and but. That's another great one. Sorry to keep interrupting, but...
No, you're fine. You're fine. In fact, I think we should talk about that briefly for those who are listening. But to tie off your question on the course, that's been my goal, is to try to take 4 years of therapy and condense it into something that people can go through. I mean, the total course is 10 hours long, and I don't mean for this to sound like a sales pitch. Of course, I'd love for people to go purchase it, but I don't really care. There's a lot of free resources on my website, but that's why I created it, is to try to teach all of these principles, the things that I teach my clients, the things that other businesses pay me to come teach, and put it into one self-paced, step-by-step package. And that's what the Extraordinary Relationships course is.
So is it... I definitely want to look into that personally. Is it already ready for sale, ready to go right now?
Yeah, it is. I just launched it a couple weeks ago. And I'll put in a coupon code for your listeners if people are interested for 50% off.
Oh, awesome.
Let's just say it'll be my website, michaelssorensen.com/outspoken. And I'll go ahead and set that live right after this for whenever this publishes. But yeah, it's live right now. There's over 100 little videos. I've tried to make them bite-sized because we're all crazy busy, And so they're 6 to 12 minutes long, but they just walk you through all of these principles and how to apply it. And then, of course, it has a bunch of worksheets, printable quotes and graphics. And then it also comes with lifetime access to the Extraordinary Relationships community, which is a private community that we're just starting up where you can discuss these things with other people who have learned the same principles, so that you're not just posting it on Reddit and getting some 16-year-old kid who thinks he wants to weigh in on your romantic relationships, So yes, it's all available, and that's all available on my website.
For sure, that sounds great. And what's the investment of the course?
So it retails for $497.
Okay.
And then I don't know what 50% off that would be.
Roughly $250. Yeah,
something like that.
No, that's awesome. I mean, I can tell you just I can't remember what I paid for the Audible book, $15, but I would say I've gotten a pretty good ROI on that. So our background, by the way, my company Unicorn, we drive paid traffic for lots of different brands. We've done quite a bit of traffic to different info products and courses.
Oh, cool.
So Maybe there's some opportunity, and a lot of our work we do now is performance based because it's way more upside, especially on the digital side. So maybe there's some opportunity for us to chat there and help scale on the digital side.
Yeah, I'd love to chat for sure.
Absolutely. So I definitely want to check out the course myself. I think that the one thing we should talk about before we bounce, and it's something, again, I feel like there's a lot of big takeaways from the book for me, but this one, again, was another big one. Avoiding using the word but as much as possible. Can you talk about that?
For sure. Yeah, I'm glad you circled back around to it, because this is crazy simple, but I think you yourself attest how powerful it is. So it is replacing the word but with and in certain conversations. I'm talking BUT, one T, right? You can still use but, whatever. Yeah. But what we're talking about here is when you're giving validation to somebody, or you're praising someone, or you're giving them feedback, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say, hey, nice work on that presentation, but, dot. And as I say that, those of you listening, where does your mind typically go? Right? You're like, hey, great work on the presentation, but you're like, oh no, what's coming, right? What do they not like about it? We throw out the positive compliment, which was, hey, great work on your presentation, and now we're just laser focused on what's coming next. And that's not always a problem, because sometimes you might just say, yeah, I'm really tired, but I'm happy to go out. That's fine. But where it becomes a problem is when you want to give candid feedback, but you also want them to hold on to, and you want them to hold on to, the compliment. So if you say, hey, great work on that presentation, and there were a few mistakes that I think we can address in the future, they're not going to like to hear that, yet it's still easier for them to appreciate and hold on to both parts of the sentence. This is huge when you're arguing with someone. It just irks me. Now my wife and I joke all the time because we see it on television shows all the time, really anywhere we see it, and it's almost like a little knife every time we hear, because you can tell when it's coming. Someone will say, okay, I can appreciate where you're coming from and why it makes sense there, but,
yeah.
and you're like, okay, you don't appreciate. So such a simple change is to say, I appreciate where you're coming from, and yeah, that makes sense, and I see it differently. And are you open to feedback? And I disagree. Such a small change, but I promise you, if you're questioning me right now, just go out and try it for a week. It makes a huge difference in allowing you to speak openly while still preserving trust and respect in the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And as you're talking it through, something I don't even know if I've ever fully acknowledged that I do this, but I've maybe made my own little custom reply. So rather than even saying and, I'll just end the sentence and say, hey, this is great. I appreciate you sharing. I also had some additional ideas for improvement in the future. Just like, hey, stop in the sentence, deep breath, they can receive it. Hey, I also had some things I think we can do moving forward that'll make it better for both of us, or whatever it is. I feel like that's actually what I've been doing subconsciously, not even saying and. As I'm thinking it through, that's what I do most now.
Because you must have picked up on the fact that but was not serving you.
And that's I actually, the people that are closest to me in life, a friend of mine, Dave, who I'm part of it's a coaching group. It's partial personal, partial business. He was telling me about something, and I was like, have you ever considered avoiding using the word but? Because we were talking about something important. And he just he's really, really intelligent guy, very self-aware. He was like, oh my God, that's a big change. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to really work on that moving forward. I mean, he's in his 60s. He's been communicating with people for a long time. And he's just like, that's a great recommendation. Thank you. I see where you're coming from. So I agree. That's a huge, huge thing. Before we bounce, is there anything you wanted to share or promote, and what's the best way to get in contact with you? I know you already shared your website for course, but
I think we've had a great conversation today, and I appreciate the questions. It's nice to dig a little deeper. Sometimes I'll talk with people and they'll just kind of ask me the high level stuff, and that's it, and that's fine, but I've appreciated our conversation. I've already mentioned my website. That's the best place to get in touch with me. And I do invite anybody listening, if they have further questions, to reach out to me. You just go to my website, michaelsorensen.com, and there's a contact form there. Please do reach out. I'd love to hear from you. And like I mentioned, I'll put together a discount for anybody that wants to purchase the course. But otherwise, check out all the free resources on my website. There's quite a bit there.
Yeah, awesome. And actually, the irony is when I asked you if you had anything else to share, I think I said the word but. So I have to, at least that was in a more appropriate setting where you weren't sharing.
You don't have to wholesale dismiss it, to be
sure.
There
will be some links in the show notes as well. And so it was awesome having you on. Glad we could connect.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Openly Outspoken with Jeremy Adams. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player so you get updated when new episodes are live. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way to support is to leave a 5-star review and share the podcast with people in your life that you feel would benefit from these types of discussions. Visit openlyoutspoken.com for additional details on the show. Find out how to connect with Jeremy on social media and learn more information about Jeremy's personal and business life. We'll see you next time.